And when we start to say that a fetus does have the right to use someone's body, we're granting them special rights that we grant to no other human beings. Your 2-year-old doesn't have a right to use your body. Your grandmother doesn't have a right to use your body. The government doesn't have a right to use your body. Nobody gets to come in and say, hey, we're going to tell you this has to happen to your body. That, to me, was probably one of the easiest conclusions I came to with regard to abortion. The problem is, what's the goal? Because some people start with a goal of abortion, I've become convinced, is healthcare, or it's a right, or it's essential. And so now I need to come up with an argument structured in such a way that protects this right. I didn't do that. I came up with I didn't come up with a principle. I fell upon this principle of bodily autonomy. I fell upon this principle of consent in many aspects of life, and just recognized that it also applied in the case of pregnancy as well. And so I remember, it's funny to be here today because a number of people would come into my Twitch stream, and I had like 25 viewers or whatever, and they'd be like, you need to go debate Destiny. And I was like, sorry, first time I was like, who's that? Because I didn't watch. But then eventually somebody was like, no, he does these debates and everything, you should go debate Destiny. I was like, okay, what do we disagree on? Because debates aren't sporting events for me. I tend to debate issues that I care about, and they're not WWE events. And every time I went over and watched, it's like, we largely agree. What was the point? And now it's interesting to be here because before we started, he told me just how absolutely wrong I am. So I'm excited because I might be wrong. But when you're coming up with principles on how we're going to grant rights and what the limitations are, I don't want a model that says, hey, let's find a way to justify abortion. I want a model that says, here's who we are and here's the rights we're going to establish. And as a following from that principle, that protects the pregnant individual's right to control their own body and not have it used by somebody else. And so I'm unwilling to grant special rights to fetuses. Now, Dawkins and I had an argument about this one time because Richard really thinks that personhood is the main issue and that he's going to define it as when brain activity begins. And so his view is largely that up until brain activity occurs and is detectable, you can just go ahead and abort because it's not a person. And I found this ultimately unsatisfying for the reason I already mentioned, one of which is I don't care if it is a person, it doesn't get to use your body. You know, that's just a simple principle in my head. But the other thing is, all it leads to is an argument about where personhood begins. And what is personhood? And I can tell you that when we live in a world where a huge chunk of people are convinced that life absolutely begins at conception and that this is a human being and a person for all intents and purposes, it's going to be very difficult to convince them that because there's not a heartbeat or not a brain or whatever the reason, and by the way, I don't know what his argument is. I'm just talking about why the personhood argument ultimately failed for me and why Dawkins and I had this disagreement. It's like, if you want to make that case, now everything becomes about defining a person, and can a person live outside the womb, and can it not live outside the womb? And none of that matters to me, because at the end of the day, each individual should be sovereign over their own body, and nobody should get the right to use it in any way without consent. And consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Consent to sex is consent to a risk of pregnancy, which has a number of different ways to alleviate it. Consent to pregnancy is not consent to remaining pregnancy, or to remaining pregnant, because different things can happen and you can change your mind. And all of those things are viable. So when you get into these discussions and people are saying, oh, well, we want to make exceptions in the case of rape or incest. Why? Did something fundamentally change about the person in there? Not in my eye. Did something fundamentally change about the non-person in there? Not in my eye for that either. So when I debated this previously, and I'm not keen on debating it for the optics, which is why at least we have two pro-choice-ish individuals up here with different justifications, I think. It was very frustrating to watch people say, but what about this scenario? What about this scenario? What about this scenario? And that's the way all the abortion discussions went. And when I realized, what is the justification for granting special rights to anyone to allow them to use someone else's body without their consent in any way? You can't take blood tissue from me. You can't draw blood from me. You can't take an organ from me. You really can't pull a hair off my head. Well, there's two reasons for that, but you shouldn't be able to do that without my consent. You shouldn't be able to have sex with somebody without their consent. It's all about consent. And people, I think, largely grasp that. They may ultimately disagree about the nature of the situation where there's a pregnant person. But as far as I can tell, bodily autonomy knocks down all of the objections, and I can't wait to hear why it's wrong.
That was a long 2 minutes, James.
Was it 10 minutes?
Oh, I thought he said 2 minutes.
Oh, I didn't hear time.
No, you're okay. You're good. You're good.
I'll shut up for
No, you're fine. So I'm a staunchly pro-choice person, but I would say that for this issue, I would definitely side with Dawkins, and that you have to recognize that the question is fundamentally, I believe, about when the fetus becomes a person that's granted some level of rights. I know that there's this, we're going to walk through a bunch of different analogies or whatever. I guess we can test each other's ideas. But I think when you talk to people and you try to figure out like how they feel just in a broad sense about abortion, you'll find that like a lot of people, I think it's 65% of people poll favorably in the first trimester. And as soon as it hits second and third, it drops off substantially. So at the very least, you can feel that intuitively, as it looks more like a baby, people seem to have this sort of revulsion of, is this a thing that we can just toss in the trash, or is it something that's like a little bit worth kind of protections? Something that we'll get into later, I guess, and I'm not sure how far you go on the abortion thing, but if it's the idea of only consenting to use your body, like I feel like these types of arguments got us into areas where you have almost nobody on your side. So for instance, the ability to abort a child in the third trimester or past 6 months of pregnancy is a position that almost nobody will defend. I feel like most of the bodily autonomy arguments are built off of what I would consider a very flawed argument, oftentimes called the violin argument, given by Thompson, I think I don't remember when she wrote that paper, but even she concedes at the end of that paper that, well, there are two big concessions she makes that nobody seems to recognize. One is she says that just because you have the right to an abortion doesn't mean you have the right to actually kill the fetus, because part of her paper was recognizing that a fetus could be a person but still be aborted. So that's one area that people don't deal with as much. And the second thing is, even she recognizes, I think she gives the example of having an abortion of a 7-month pregnancy because you're worried you're going to miss a vacation is probably not good justification for it. So it seems like even she recognizes that there's like a little bit of moral revulsion or something bad happening there when you're having an abortion for no justifiable reason. But like I said, there's a whole bunch of different arguments we can get back into relating to the violin argument and different analogies, kind of test where we're at there, then I kind of figure out how you truly feel when it comes to the abortion thing.
Oh, I have no problem telling people how I truly feel.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, when I say that, I mean to say you're concealing it, but like...
It's making fun.
Okay, sure. Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going to have like a bunch of analogies, because I do agree this is a really hard area. Well, not for you because it's bodily autonomy, but for me it's very challenging. So let me ask some questions and try to navigate. So I'll give, for people that aren't aware of it, the classical violin apprenticeship, musicianship society has kidnapped a poor lady, stuck her in bed, and when she wakes up, she realizes that her kidneys are attached to the world's greatest violin player. And they tell her, listen, ma'am, you have to remain in bed for 9 weeks, otherwise the world's best violin player is going to die. And then the question is, does this lady have a right to unplug herself, or does she have a moral obligation to sit there and basically use her kidneys to clean the blood of this world's greatest violin player, even though she didn't consent to being stuck in that situation? That's like the classic violin argument from Thompson's paper, right? Mm-hmm.
And, you had a question. I didn't want to jump on it.
No, well, I was going to ask, first I was going to ask if you agree that it's like, as a premise that I've laid out, you've agreed that this is like an okay summary of the situation.
Yeah, basically that's Judith Jarvis Thompson's version of the violinist argument. Mm-hmm. And the issue actually goes beyond that. It's, if you wake up and find yourself attached to that violinist, do you have some moral duty or obligation to stay there?
Yeah.
Then there's the secondary question of, does society have a right to force you to stay there? Mm-hmm. And even if you consented, do you have a right to disconnect? And so my view is that consent can be withdrawn, mm-hmm. although as soon as we start talking about consent being withdrawn, there may be complications with contract law and things like that. But that doesn't exist in this analogy. Mm-hmm. And so not only does the person who finds himself attached to the violinist have every right to withdraw, nobody has a right to force them to stay there, but they can voluntarily say, I'm going to go ahead and, I hate that you guys did this to me, but I'm going to suck it up because I'm going to value this situation. But when it comes to moral duty, like that would be moral virtue, I would say, to stay attached. Mm-hmm. But it's not a moral duty to stay attached, in my view.
Okay, so I feel like there's a lot of intuition pumping with this analogy, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions around it to see if you still feel the same way. You might, but I'm just curious.
Cool.
So let's say that instead of the violinist argument, let's say that you wake up, and what you actually find is your 2-year-old child is attached to you, and your kidneys are filtering his blood. Do you think in that sense, when it's your child, if they need your kidneys to survive for, say, 6 weeks, does the parent still have a right to disconnect themselves and say,
yes.
well, I don't consent to that? Yeah?
Yeah. The fact that it's morally virtuous and that you might, and it doesn't make it a moral duty, the fact that you have a certain feeling towards one person as opposed to another, that is a different aspect of the person that's connected there, not of the moral situation. And so it's like a minute ago when you were doing your summary, sorry, that sat on my coat, you talked about how I wrote it down because I want to make sure I didn't misrepresent it. My position polls unpopularly, and almost nobody agrees with my side, and so that is about a strategy about which model, personhood or bodily autonomy, sells better. But I don't give a shit about what sells better. I care about what's right. Once upon a time, none of them sold good. And I think that the value is in teaching people the right thing, convincing them that nobody has a right to use your body without your consent. And that, you can convince them any number of reasons, and I'm glad we're largely on the same side of this. But at the end of the day, that most people don't currently find it convincing is an argument for everything that failed up till now.
Sure, I agree. In kind of looking at public polling, I'm just curious where the moral intuitions of people lie. That's kind of what I'm trying to gauge. And I think abortion
would the moral intuitions of people currently,
yeah.
Do you think they're representative of, a good chunk of the people, like my parents are single issue voters and it's abortion.
Mine are as well.
And their moral...
Wait, are yours pro-life?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so are mine, yeah.
Yeah. No, my mom thinks I'm working for Satan.
Yeah.
No, he's not.
Yeah, I haven't got a paycheck from him either. But their view on this is one where they're not going to agree with either of us on any issue.
Sure.
There's nothing at all. It's a baby from the second that sperm hits the egg, and that's what God wants. And okay, so there's no argument that I can come up with that either of us are going to use to sway them. When you talk about the polling of how many people disagree, that's a huge chunk of them are in that boat. If there are people who are accepting of personhood arguments, I'm fine for strategically, as long as it's honest, because I agree with you. Prior to brain activity and everything else, I don't think there's a good argument to be made that it's a person and that you shouldn't grant it rights. All I'm saying is that if it were a person and we did grant it rights, it still wouldn't have this right.
Sure, I guess so. Okay, we'll get to that. Just the only reason why I'm looking at that abortion moral intuition thing is because I've noticed something that I think Thomas actually brought this up when he was writing his Supreme Court opinion. It's interesting, or no, I think Alito brought this up. It's interesting that we've done things with gay marriage, we've done things with civil rights, we've done a lot of stuff where the people's opinions have kind of moved over time on it, but abortions seem like they're stuck. Even from Roe, even from Casey, the abortion opinion has been still hotly divided in the United States, and I don't see much movement there. So I'm just kind of curious, or rather I would say that's a curiosity to me. I agree, at one point in time we could have polled and found the majority of Americans in favor of slavery. It's not a good argument to maintain the institution of slavery, but it's an interesting thing to see how unwavering a lot of people's opinions are related to abortion. And then I kind of like to look at that, where is what is the moral intuition that's kind of feeling this idea of what's right or wrong related to abortion.
I agree, and on a side note, sorry, I'm incredibly frustrating watching a lot of things, but in particular elections where almost everyone is 51-49, 51-49, 51. How can this nation be so equally divided on things? And maybe it's the case that we've run up against the wall on where there can be nuanced positions, and now it's just, boom, abortion, yes or no. Boom, pick your issue, yes or no, gay marriage, yes or no. And we're just stuck that we've hit this kind of 50-50.
Well, that's another reason why I kind of like the personhood argument. I hate, okay, we're going to go back to the ethics, but getting into the pragmatic side, because I wanted to be the ethics of it. But on the pragmatic side, I think the majority of Americans, I think, could come together on a federal protection for first trimester abortions. I think that could be a push. Third trimester and second trimester is insane, though. You lose so many people. Most Democrats won't back you up on like a second or third trimester abortion. So from a pragmatic, like political side, I feel like first trimester federal protection, maybe that's something you can push for. But anything past that, people are just going to look at you like you're crazy. And
maybe we could educate them that that's not even really a real thing. That when we're talking about abortion rights, abortion isn't a right to kill anything. It's a right to terminate the pregnancy. And late-term terminations of pregnancy are often delivered in C-sections. And any time where there is an abortion that results in the final trimester in the death of a fetus, it is normally for extraordinary medical circumstances. And so they want to keep pushing it back further and further and further until it's gone. And what I'm saying is we should push it all the way out, because you can deliver 2 days before. There is no such thing as a let's kill the baby 2 days before. That just does not happen. And so it's a fiction to portray late-term abortions in that sense. And
well,
so
no,
while
but there
I agree,
are, like, you have like the evacuations and everything. Like there are, like, for second trimester, like where you just abort and destroy the fetus, right? Like I don't think they attempt to deliver those and have those like adopted or something if you go in at 5 months for an abortion.
well, specifically it applies to non-viable fetuses, which means that they couldn't survive on their own. Well, by the time it's viable, all of a sudden the termination of pregnancy takes on a different form that isn't abortion.
Sure. Okay, so returning back to the violin argument. So you would say that if it was your 2-year-old child connected to you, you would still have the right to just sever that connection and say, peace out.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that. So I look at abortion from a legal standpoint about rights.
Well, we're getting to legal, but right now I'm on the moral part, because I guess what I'm kind of teasing is I feel like we do have a form of like. Stephen Wagner wrote about this in a 2013 paper. He called this de facto guardianship. That there are situations that we can be in life where the situations have essentially appointed you as a sort of de facto guardian, where you call these special rights, but I would argue that people would say, like, yeah, there are cases where there are special rights, where these things do exist, where people do have some right to your resources, your body, your whatever. For instance, like I think most people would say, if I went to the pool and I was just sitting there hanging out, having a smoke, whatever, and a kid walks next to me and he just falls in and he's drowning, and all I have to do is reach over and kind of like pick him up and put him aside, and I just sit there and I watch him die, I might not be a murderer, but I think ubiquitously people would condemn me as not taking action. They wouldn't say, well, it would have been virtuous for you to pick the kid up. They would say, no, you have a moral obligation there because you are the only person in that situation that could have provided life-saving treatment to this person, and it's not going to put you into the way of like fatal harm.
I agree.
So I think these 3 tenets of like de facto guardianship can be used to argue for a fetus that exists inside your body that you have the ability to bring to term. You are the only one that can provide such an ability, and it generally won't cause you seriously bodily harm. And if it does, most people, almost everybody is in favor. Even the strictest of Catholics I've spoken to will say, yeah, if the life of the mother is going to be destroyed, then the mother can of course terminate the pregnancy. I think most people agree with that.
Yeah, so setting aside the legal stuff, which is the only thing I truly care about for this, because all I care about is whether or not people have a right to access this. The moral question is a little more complex, and I have largely shrugged it off. I tend to draw a distinction between moral duty and moral virtue. And yes, if a kid falls into the pool next to you, I would argue that if there is no risk on your part at all, that you have a moral duty to make some minimal effort to save that kid. That's not the case with pregnancy, because pregnancy is not a minimal effort. Pregnancy fundamentally changes the person who's pregnant forever. Carrying a child to term changes their body forever, comes with considerable risk, has hormonal changes to their body, physical changes to their body. This is not the same as reaching over and picking up a kid. This is saying, I'm going to commit 9 months of my health, putting it at risk for this. I don't know that you could, it would be like saying, okay, there's a kid drowning in the pool and you need to rescue him, but the first thing you need to do is dive underwater and swim 100 feet, pick up the kid, hold him there and float for hours, risking whether or not you can drown, and then hope to be rescued. That's closer to pregnancy, and it's still not there.
Sure. So I agree with you. But what I wanted to look at is the principle of, because I've noticed you use this argument a couple of times, that when people talk about the fetus, they actually give it more rights than a normal person. You're not just giving it normal human rights, you're giving it super rights to the right to somebody else's body.
Yeah.
But I would like to point out that I feel like there actually are times where people do have those like super rights. That there does exist this social moral obligation between certain people that are appointed to these de facto guardianships where they alone could save somebody's life with relatively minimal effort, and it wouldn't just be morally virtuous, it'd be like a moral obligation of them to do so.
But moral obligation and right are two different categories. Right is the legal aspect that I was talking about. Moral obligation and moral duty have nothing to do with rights.
True.
You don't have a
We're
right
not at
to
rights
moral
yet,
obligation.
but in order to, so in my opinion, law is downstream from morality. So before,
but we don't merely legislate morality.
we don't.
And
Being an
so
asshole is not
there are
illegal.
laws
I'm
that
not in
have
jail.
nothing to do with morality, and there
Sure.
are morals that have nothing to do with law. But what you said was, I make an argument saying, oh, you're giving special rights to the fetus, but there's a situation where you have a moral obligation. Special rights are rights. Moral obligation is separate from rights.
Gotcha. I guess when I'm using rights here, I'm only speaking in the ethical sense so far. Sorry. If I talk about like a right that you have as a person to be like, not killed by another person, I would argue that's like a type of moral right that you ought to not be murdered by another person. Sorry, I'll be clear there.
This is why I've drawn a distinction. Sorry, this is why I've drawn a distinction between legal rights and moral virtues and duties.
Sure,
But
which is
go
fair.
ahead.
So, and then the only reason I say this is because when we talk about legal stuff that gets enshrined in law, there's like a kind of a group consensus on morals and ethics that eventually downstream make their way into like what is legal, generally speaking. Right? Yeah. Hopefully, that's the dream.
What is it though?
What?
Would you want to legislate everything that you view a moral duty?
For moral duties, probably not everyone, but some of them should be. And in the case of abortion, I don't believe this, but if you feel like it is a person from the moment of conception, this would probably be one of the most important things to enshrine in law. Because anytime we're talking about murdering or killing somebody, we'll say killing somebody, then that's probably going to call forth some sort of like legal ramification if that exists.
So what's the foundational principle that allows you and me and us to get together and say, you're pregnant and you're staying that way? What is the principle that allows us to dictate to someone else how their body is going to be used?
So answering that question, in revisiting the violin argument, one of the reasons why this is disanalogous is because the violin argument, not in my opinion, is a form of rape. The person didn't consent to being there. But I would argue that if you are engaging in sexual activity, you are consenting to the idea that there is some percentage chance that you will become pregnant. And if you do become pregnant, to kill a fetus because of your action, that you knowingly knew that like something could happen, I think that part makes it fundamentally different than saying, like, oh, well, now you're enslaved to do this, you have to do this, when you knowingly made a choice to get there.
So this is where I talked earlier about the difference between exceptions in rape and incest, which I know poll extremely well, because most people fundamentally grasp, holy crap, we wouldn't want to hold somebody responsible for something they had no say in. The problem is, what if you did consent, but you consented knowing that you lived in a system where one of the available options was to terminate a pregnancy? What if you lived in a system where you have a chemical solution, RU-486 or whatever, or a medical procedure, or not draconian laws that tried to shut it all down before you even knew you were pregnant, but all of these were options. And so you acted perfectly responsibly. You used contraception. It failed. Why on earth should everybody else in society get together and say, we're not going to dictate we're going to take away this one chance that you have? It's like saying if you're playing baseball out in the yard and you hit a ball into somebody's window, well, first of all, the kids that probably did that aren't going to be able to pay for it, so the parents are going to end up being liable. But in any case, the responsibility is still there, but there's a number of different ways to alleviate it, which is maybe you could work off the window, maybe you could repair the window, maybe any number of things like that. And for us to say, no, we find this one, some of us find this one so morally objectionable that we're going to tell you what you can't do.